everyone, welcome to Dating and Development. If you know who I am, you know who I am. If you don't know who I am, now you know. Very warm welcome to you all. Before we get started, make sure you comment, like and subscribe. Get all that good stuff out of the way first. Helps the channel grow. And the music in the background, yes, it is classical music. So what? Fight me on it. Now, scrolling the internet the other day, more than likely it was Facebook looking for some dank memes, and I came across this article of a game that I'm very into, and that game being Final Fantasy VII Remake to add to it. Now, this article was referencing that FF7 Remake Part 2 needs to make LGBTQ relationships canon. Final Fantasy VII Remake needs to add LGBTQ relationships to the story to help represent modern audience and add better relatability and diversity. Now, before I get started, I'm no bigot. I'm not against people who are into the same type of people, if you catch my drift. Yes, add LGBTQ characters to the game. However, do not force it into the narrative where it does not need to be. I don't want to come across Bart identifying as macro reactor number 7 and then deleting everyone on the screen in his limit break. Nor do I want Cloud to come out as full on. Actually, I don't want to, but there's no reason for Cloud to come out as full on into men because the narrative forced it. That's not going to bide well with the players because no one wants this kind of thing forced onto them. Because in that saying that, you're tampering with nostalgia, and no one wants nostalgia to be tampered with because they have very certain memories. They have memories, emotional bonds, ties. This is sounding like Kingdom Hearts. They have ties to this franchise, and this franchise means a lot to a whole heap of people. And everything doesn't have to be LGBTQ. At least not to mention that when this game came out, I did not come across any sort of controversy in relation to this game with its lack of diversity. Now, things can be insinuated, especially in the original, where you could go on dates with Aerith, Yuffie, Tifa, Vincent, was Vincent the Gold Saucer? Can't remember. Even Bart, for crying out loud. So it already goes to speak. No one wants this kind of narrative forced into the game, or into any game, as a matter of fact, that people hold dearly to them, because they don't want the original to change. Romance tends to be part of any RPG games, and has become more prominent in recent years. The Final Fantasy VII Remake is no exception. While the original Final Fantasy VII game had very little in the way of romantic subplots, it did, considering Tifa, Yuffie, Zack Cloud, and Cloud. Towards the end, there was a big romantic subplot there between the three of them, and that was quite integral to the game. Final Fantasy VII Remake integrated a much more involved love triangle between Cloud, Aerith, and Tifa. Yes, they did, but this was the exact same for Final Fantasy VII, the original one, but it was hidden under a lot of subcontext, and it was layered. This unneeded addition, however, continues a trend of lacking romantic diversity in the Final Fantasy series as a whole, which has shown no inclusion of LGBT main characters to date. Look, Square Enix have released games where LGBT characters in Life is Strange, where the protagonist is bi. Least not to mention, you could go with a date on Bart and the Gold Saucer, depending on the point system, whether it's a date with Aerith, Tifa, or Yuffie. Was it catchy as well? The original Final Fantasy VII left much to the imagination as far as character relationships go. It didn't necessarily leave a lot to the imagination, because you do have the Final Fantasy VII compilation, including Crisis Core, Before Crisis, and Advent Children. At least not to mention Dirge of Cerberus, which I haven't played, but I've seen the cutscenes in that on YouTube. Interactions between characters weren't expressed as explicitly romantic. Yes, they were, if you knew the context. And this ambiguity allowed fans for Final Fantasy VII to either ship more mainstream couples like Cloud and Tifa, or they could look into relationships that were more relatable to their own personal lives, like Vincent and Cloud. I think that's kind of more of a fetish thing. And yeah, if you want to relate to it, really go ahead. But as I said, I think it was more of a fetish thing. And I'm going to read out some comments on a Final Fantasy VII group I am a member of on Reddit, maybe. Carrying on. By erasing the Final Fantasy VII, by erasing this in Final Fantasy VII Remake and pushing the love triangle, the game has disposed of the more delicate approach of letting the player connect the dots in their own way, no longer allowing them to decide for themselves which characters might have a personal interest in each other. That never happened in the original. Now, before I carry on even further, Final Fantasy VII is a game I hold dearly to heart. It's probably my top 10 games of all time. It's a fantastic game, not a perfect game. By no means a stretch of the imagination, it is a perfect game, but it is an absolute fantastic game. And the themes it has in it are very personal to a lot of people. You're dealing with loss, you're dealing with acceptance, you're dealing with coming to terms of your past, you're living in an environment that's being destroyed day in, day out. You're learning how to cope with the sudden loss of people in your life, as I just said. You're dealing with a lot of things. And these are universal human themes that people resonate with deeply. Even without the inclusion of LGBT cast and characters, main cast and characters, should I say, people still deeply resonated with it. And the lack of diversity didn't bother me, not because I'm a straight guy, but because the themes in the game are themes everyone can relate to, and that's why a lot of people love this game as well. Combat system, yeah, fair enough. The character development, yes, but the overall arching themes, it's not just about saving the planet, it's also about who you are as a person. If the Final Fantasy VII Remake is going to take away players' ability to draw their own conclusions about romantic interactions, it would only seem right to finally add LGBTQA plus representation into the games. Didn't Red 13 not reproduce alone? A large number of fans for the game identify as members of the LGBTQA plus community, and by forcing engagement in heteronormative relationships, these players are isolated and prevented from being able to find relatable romantic content. Okay, yeah, that's all well and good. But there are people who are bi or full-on gay or lesbian who are into this game. In games like Dragon Age, the inclusion of LGBTQA plus characters has not only made the game more diverse, but extends content to a wider audience, allowing more fans to enjoy the game on a personal level. Now, you can't compare Final Fantasy VII to Dragon Age. Final Fantasy VII is pretty linear in its gameplays, and Dragon Age a lot more broader and what allows people to do. That's what I've heard. But anyways, carrying on. Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 would benefit by following this example. Instead of pushing outdated love triangles where the female characters feel like nothing more than trophies for the player to win. They're not like trophies, they work by your side. Tifa and Aerith kick ass. Tifa and Aerith go and save Cloud from Don Corneo. They kick ass in that scene, and with the soundtrack ripping, smashing, playing, absolute banger of a tune, it adds to it a lot more. Like, that shows like the female strength and female, you go girl kind of thing, which is, I like that in the game. It changed things up a small bit. It wasn't pushing some sort of agenda, not at all. And they're not like trophies for you to win. Cloud and Aerith Tifa and Aerith, save Cloud a good few times. Tifa saves Cloud from himself in the original when she dives into his unconscious when they end up in the live stream after the Medial incident with the earthquake due to Ultimate Weapon. It's not outdated love triangles. You see who truly likes each other in the game, and there's a lot of context and subcontext provided in order for this. And even had the honeybee in as well. And hopefully they probably mentioned this as well in this article. It is past time for Final Fantasy VII games to join a more inclusive era. While the developers did a good job with bringing the honeybee scenes up to date, the matter of fact is that the story of Final Fantasy VII still lacks inclusive characters who represent the wider audience that enjoy the Final Fantasy VII series. So really, was a honeybee in a big joke to them all? Was it a big joke to you all? But the thing is, I'm getting from this article, they want the main characters to be LGBT, and that's not how it's going to work, because if you're forcing an agenda on nostalgia and people and characters who people have a big connection to and highly like, then a lot of people are going to be upset. Not being Snowflake or anything like that, but you're going to make a lot of people hurt, and people aren't going to like it, because if you're forcing something on someone, people are not going to take well to it. They just aren't, and that's how people tend to be. Moving onwards, this lack of diversity hurts FF7 Remake, taking large steps backwards from the original that left doors open for players to make their own choices and draw their own conclusions about content. Like, you had the point system and who you take with a date and the gold saucer. You could even take Barrett on a fucking date. Shut the fuck up. Wasn't leaving doors open. It was a fairly linear story. What are you talking about? Like, if you want to include LGBT people in this game, by all means necessary do, but do not force it. There's no need to force it. Have them as introduce them as new characters to the plot. Have NPCs who represent the LGBT community. That's perfectly fine and well and good. But if you're pushing an agenda onto main characters and changing them who they are, changing the history that they have with pop culture, with the media, with people who identify and resonate with them, people are not going to be happy. They just aren't. They just aren't. Further on, taking away this autonomy for an outdated romantic agenda does nothing for FF7 Remake, and is frustrating for those who can no longer feel connected to the story's characters. Look, I deeply connect with Cloud Strife. He reminds me a lot of myself. Him being a person he wasn't, that was me for years. And then, you know, that mentality of pretending to be something you're not gets at you. And that was happening to me too. And I had a breakdown where I had to stop being someone who I wasn't, because that wasn't me. And I had to accept myself for who I was and work on myself. Like that honeybee in FF7R was a fantastic scene. A man cross-dressing in a game that hardly happens in video games, or mainstream video games, should I say. Furthermore, adding to that, you have Andrea Rodea. You know, could he swing towards the direction of men? Yeah, definitely. I could definitely see it with the dance scene between himself and Cloud. Like, no one wants to get Final Fantasy VII Woke Edition, being perfectly honest. It can be added to the future of Final Fantasy VII. However, stick to what the game is and game was, and don't make up relationships just for something. It's not going to work. By adding LGBTQA plus characters and representation to FF7R Remake Part 2, the game would be up to date with the diversity that is being seen in other games. Like, to be honest, would you ship Sora and Riku? Just joking, from Kingdom Hearts. But imagine if Kairi in Kingdom Hearts decides to become Cairo and just punch Zora in the face. Or just, you know, carry Sora under her arm and start punching memories of Xehanort in the balls. Maybe people might find that funny. But look, it is what it is. And carrying on. This would also allow a wider audience the ability to connect to content in the Final Fantasy VII Remake outside of the heteronormative romance subplots, and end the idea that all characters are perceived as straight in the series. Not all characters. Andrea Rodea, for example. You know? If adding more concrete romantic storylines is how the developers want to go, Remake Part 2 should cement other romantic storylines that include their wider audience, allowing fans of the original to continue to find themselves in the characters that they have come to love over decades of gameplay. As said, if you're going to force main characters to change or just a push an agenda. No one's going to buy it, and no one's going to like it. I'm going to read some comments that I found as well. People are saying that they're not liking this article. That is a bunch of garbage. People saying, if this concept bothers you, look inward. Some replied, nobody here is bothered about the LGBTQ content. Rather the change of the story that was created by artists that deserve respect and loved by its fans that do as well. It was already pointed out here that there'd be no problem if the game introduced in upcoming games like Final Fantasy 16. Perfectly agree with that. That's all well and good. And people like to look inwards. Internal struggle and everything else seems to be an argument. Some saying, why not? And someone makes a comment here. It's an issue of retrofitting archetypes onto established characters. Final Fantasy VII was one of the few games of its time to feature LGBTQ characters, and shoehorning it into the main cast at this point just serves to stoke controversy. Suddenly wishing the remake was more faithful to the original puts you in the same camp as, ooh, being a man who loves men is yucky. People, and instead of just being a remake of your favourite game, it becomes political ammunition stoking unneeded animosity, as seen in the rest of the comments on this post. If Square Enix wants to make a game that panders to the LGBTQ plus community, then they should make a new game with LGBTQ plus characters. Changing the established characters would be disingenuous pandering at this point. Dead right. It would be pandering. No one wants to play, as I said, play Final Fantasy VII Woke Edition. Someone has commented, I would say keep the original storyline but add LGBT elements, like Andre, for example. I love seeing the LGBT representation in media nowadays, but the story of FF7 should be kept as close as possible. Sexuality didn't quite make the game's story what it is, so don't change the story. Yeah, as I said, universal themes. And Cloud did hook up with Tifa. But hey, you have Polytriad all the way with Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith. There's a photo of them before the ghost graveyard. Red 13 produces on his own. My joke to you. And yeah, people just aren't happy with someone who tries to push a narrative. Now I'll leave you with one last comment. As with all properties, if it fits in within the narrative, fine. But they better not suddenly reveal one of the main characters or bi or gay just for the sake of representation. This is the narrative problem some series have, and it can ruin a series if the fan base keep whining about it. RWBY, I can't know what that game is a good example of how a fan base crying for a certain ship and representation ruined the overall narrative for the sake of inclusion. I'm sure we'll get some manner of representation for this community, and hell, we've already had a start with characters like Jules and Andrea Rodea. Including new characters or even reintroducing old ones like any of the old Turks from before Crisis can put a spin on these, as these characters' orientations weren't fully established. Something like having Aerith suddenly revealing she's bi can have some unintended consequences on the narrative. So long as the story they're telling is good and it flows, I'll be on board if the writing staff added in some LGBTQ representation in the future. And there you have it. People aren't a whole lot happy about this. They don't want this in the game. What is it? They don't want main characters to be forced to fit into a narrative or an agenda. Include elements by all means necessary, but if you tamper with people's nostalgia, if you tamper with things that people love and push a narrative on it or an agenda, they're not going to be happy, and that's how people react to it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you comment, like, subscribe and share. Until next time, take care, God bless, and be better. Talk soon.